get started with today's presentation. Today we're lucky to have a presentation by Diana Del Bel Belluz and Bill Haskett around strategy. Diana and Bill are great mentors and great experts in the field. And I don't know, Diana, would you mind introducing yourself? And then Bill, I feel like I could do a good job on introducing you, but I'd rather just offload it to you. So Diana, can you introduce yourself and tell you a bit about this and how you came to this topic? You're on mute, so switch.
There you go. So I have been in the field of risk management for pretty much my entire career, 30-ish years or more. And but I've also always used techniques from the field of decision analysis. So maybe I'm a little strange amongst risk management people. I've been a member of SDP for over 5 years, and I'm always looking for ways to integrate good ideas, good tools, good methods from different disciplines to help people make better decisions under uncertainty and risk. I love to read the Harvard Business Review, and there was a great article in the May-June issue. It was called Lean Strategy, and when I read it, I recognize some things that we see in the world of decision analysis, and it also kind of gave a challenge to how can we make better strategic decisions. So I actually was chatting about it with Sean, who's on this call, and he said you should do a talk for the chapter. And so anyway, so the article takes a lean perspective. I wanted to provide an enterprise risk management perspective, and I recruited Bill to provide a decision quality perspective. So that's how we're here to do this. And I always love interactive sessions. So Bill and I are going to try not to talk too long so that we preserve some time at the end to have some interactive discussion, because the last few sessions of this group have had really excellent interactive discussions. So I'd like to keep that going.
Great, thanks, Diana. Over to you, Bill.
And hi, I'm Bill Haskett. I'm a decision support consultant here in Vancouver, but I have a company in the US as well. I've been doing this since I was assistant chief geologist at an large intermediate independent oil company back in the late 80s, where I thought I knew what I was doing, and I had a lot of the tools, but I was an island unto myself in the company. And so I learned that there's a better way to do things. And 2000, I left the company, and I've been consulting ever since. So I am, like Diana, we are evil consultants.
You're not an evil consultant. You're brilliant around this, I guess. But do you want to touch a little bit about the strategy itself and this context for this presentation?
Sure.
So we built that into the presentation,
we built
actually.
That in. Okay, great.
Yep.
But just to let you know, I'm a process skeptic. I'd rather see do, which is supported well by decision support, but decision support without do is useless, navel gazing. And so I tend to be less process pedantic than many people would hope for.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing of myself. Amongst risk consultants, I tend to focus much more on what's going to help you make good decisions to achieve your goals, as opposed to being in compliance, making sure you've ticked all the boxes for a risk register. So I think Bill and I are quite aligned in that way. So who's got the presentation up?
I do.
Okay, let's jump to that.
And I got to say, I'm really happy to see a lot of the guests that are non-Vancouver chapter people here. You are more than welcome to be here at any of our meetings, which ideally happens on the third Thursday of the month at 4 p.m.
Okay, so let's start with our title. So perspectives, we will give the 3 perspectives from a decision quality, enterprise risk management, and lean. So 3 decision support perspectives on strategy execution. And we'd like to talk about, what prospects for enhanced strategy execution come out of that discussion. So that's our interactive part at the end. Next slide, please. So 3 things we want to leave you with at the end, but we'll start with them at the beginning. So we believe that most organizations experience a significant gap between their strategic objectives, their plan, and their actual performance. And that's one of the things in the Harvard article. At some point, I'll put it in the chat so that if you want to go and read it and find out more, that comes out very strong in that article. Various disciplines have developed approaches to close this gap. That's what we're going to be talking to you about. And then if you want to enhance your strategy execution decisions, the questions you ask matter. So with each of the 3 perspectives, we're going to wrap it up with some key questions that come out of that management perspective, that way of thinking. Next slide, please. So we'll start off. I'll give you like a little bit of a book report on that article that really highlights this strategy to performance gap. Then we'll look at the 3 ways of framing the opportunity to close that gap. I'll present the first 2. Oh, no, I guess I won't. The first one, Bill will do the second one, and then I'll round it off with the risk perspective. And then we'll have the discussion and sharing. Next slide, please. So next slide. We wanted to start by actually defining what we mean by strategy, because that word gets thrown around a lot, and there's lots of different definitions. This is Bill's favorite definition, and I like it too. So it's strategy is the central, integrated, but externally oriented concept of how a firm will achieve its objectives. So in my mind, the way I picture this happening, so I'm going to ask you, Bill, to advance. So we start with today's business model. So we've got a red factory, and it's got a capacity of 2 smokestacks anyway. And then we have to think about how we wish to succeed in the future. And next. And one of the things we have to think about is how the world is going to be different in the future than it is today. So what will our external business environment be? That's the externally oriented. And then we can think about different strategic visions. So we might expand on our red widget factory to have 3 smokestacks, or we might diversify. We might add a 2 smokestack green widget factory, or we might actually transform the business where we switch from red widgets to green widgets, and it's an even bigger going concern than the current one. So these are the kinds of things that we do when we define a strategy, a strategic plan, and both our vision for the future and how we're going to get there. Next slide, please.
I just want to jump in and say that when you're working on a strategy project, you have to understand, you have to know if it is an incremental strategy development. So are you branching off directly from what you're doing now? Or is it transformational? Are you going to jump out and do something different that requires a more complex framing, a more complex control and an assessment, competitive advantage assessment? Understand the difference between incremental and transformational is important because it uses a slightly different process and different tools are preferred.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. So in the HBR article, the author, Michael Mankins, talks about these two strategic processes. And so he makes this, he differentiates between strategy formulation or strategizing. So that's really articulating that vision of future success and how it's going to be pursued. And it's typically done by the executive leadership team. And there's a whole consulting business of strategic planning that helps companies do this. The second process, Bill, if you advance once more, is strategy implementation or execution. Those words get used interchangeably, and we'll use them interchangeably today, which is really about choosing and performing all the activities necessary to achieve what has been planned in the strategy formulation. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my sound here. And and one of the distinctions here is that typically everyone has a role in strategy implementation. Oh, next slide, please. So, as I said, the article kind of asks this question, how good are we at strategic decisions? So, and it starts from this lean perspective that in lean manufacturing, the goal is to standardize, to make standard work out of critical processes. And as a result of standardizing, it increases the throughput, the costs go down, and the quality of the products rises. So, and in thinking about strategic decision making, the author says it is the epitome of non-standard work. It's the opposite in most organizations. And one of the main reasons is that leaders think of strategy and strategic decisions as unique, with every decision requiring its own customized, bespoke process. And that leads to slower, lower quality decisions. So the author is a member of Bain & Company, and they surveyed executives at 350 companies about their strategy processes. And the results really show that this inconsistent decision-making process is a big part of the problem. So I want to jump into a few of those results now, because I always like data anyway, and evidence. So the first thing is it showed that consistency of decision processes varied. So as I mentioned, there's a whole industry set up around strategy formulation. And because of that, about 50% of the companies used standard templates for developing their strategic plans. So there was the highest amount of consistency in strategy formulation. Next. So when it comes to strategy implementation, very few firms followed a consistent approach. And instead, they used a they let their accountable executive for a decision determine the process for the decision. So they designed their own process, and or they had a few different standard processes that varied by the type of decision, but not a standard kind of process that went across. So clearly they found there was not the consistency, very low consistency on the process for strategy implementation. Next slide, please. When it came to the quality of the decisions, 25, in hindsight, they said about 25% of strategic decisions proved to be suboptimal. So why were they suboptimal? Either the leadership chose a course of action that was incorrect or inferior to other options, so they didn't pick the best path, or the decisions were costly and impossible to reverse that forced the company to live with the consequences of that, and the consequences being poor performance for years, or poorer than expected performance, poorer than desired performance. Next slide. So they also looked at the speed of decisions, and that was deemed too slow. And again, in hindsight, 45% of the time it was deemed to be too slow. And so even when the right choice was eventually made, the performance suffered because the market and competitive conditions had shifted. So the decision was made for the way the world used to be, not the way the world was turning into. Okay, next slide, please. So, and this is the big result, that on average, companies said they achieved less than 70% of the results that they were aiming for. So that's an over 30% gap in performance. So that's that gap between strategy to performance. And it got blamed on poor execution. So the assumption by saying it's poor execution is that, well, it was a good strategy, but it just wasn't executed well. But in fact, through the survey, it came out that in many cases, the formulated strategy was unclear, and that led to uncoordinated, conflicting actions. So working at cross purposes that produce these mediocre, suboptimal outcomes. In other cases, leaders thought they'd made a decision, but they had only articulated what their desired outcome was, and they really didn't define the actions needed to achieve it or the resources. And so performance fell short because there was nothing concrete for the organization to execute, right? So people are doing this kind of thing, right? Trying to figure out what to do next. Next slide. So he came to the conclusion that it's time to redesign the strategy process to achieve better results. And using this lean perspective, he said, if we had a manufacturing process that had a 25% defect rate, exceeded the target cycle times more than 45% of the time, and had a yield loss of more than 30%, it would be deemed unacceptable. So that's kind of, the mindset the frame he used to justify thinking about how to redesign the process. Next slide, please. So he was really talking about having an inconsistent process. Bill and I identified a number of other causes we see of poor strategy execution, and we'll address them a little bit as we go forward. So one is unsurfaced assumptions. So mistaking a belief for a certainty, and especially when we're thinking about what's happening in the external environment, that can really blind us as decision makers and executors of the decision to signals that the business environment is shifting and that we need to course correct. Second one, Bill, do you want to speak to it, or would you like me to? You're on mute.
Yeah, somebody keeps muting me. I'm unmuted for about 3 seconds and then it gets muted again. Stop doing that, whoever's doing it. Okay, so one of the things that bothers me about the strategy is that that management will just say, we're going to do this now. And yet they have a portfolio of projects which are underway, which are upcoming, and it's not appropriate probably for the new strategy. And that's where he talks about the strategic gap, and that's a source of that. But when you have a portfolio and you have a strategy that it's supposed to be aimed at, what I find is that people generally don't know how many projects there has to be in it, what the content of them are, the timing of the projects, to ensure that the portfolio is as robust enough to withstand uncertainty. People still aren't thinking about uncertainty when they're making the decisions. And also, what I've found, especially in resource companies, is that they count on success being present despite the odds against it. So it's, don't worry, we're going to tell people we're going to achieve X, we want to achieve X, but you don't have the prospect, you don't have the project in order to give you a reasonable chance of making it. Right? That's all I want to say about that. You go in with the other ones, Diana.
Okay. So another one is a failure to understand the critical control points. And in fact, I'll talk about that from the risk perspective, not just not understanding the critical control points, but even having a shared understanding of what the execution plan is, right? So we have these objectives and some very broad paths to get there, but each executive has a different idea about what the path to get there is. And so the failure to be externally focused. So that's really about saying, we're going to be, the best in our field, whatever. We're going to do things internally, maybe have the best project management, whatever it is, but not be focused externally on what we have to do to meet the needs of the external environment, to be successful in the competitive environment we are in. And then the last one, I love this. This comes from Bill, failing to meet the hot dog stand test. So let's go to the next slide. So what is the hot dog stand test? It basically says if your strategy applies as much to a hot dog stand as it does to your company, it's probably not a strategy. And here's some great examples on the next slide. Let's see if things like this are familiar. So we're going to be a low-cost producer, double our size, be fast responder, best in customer service, prioritize profit. I love that one. One step ahead of the competition. So these, you probably have seen organizational or worked in organizations that have strategies like this. So
one of the ones I saw recently is plastered on the side of a building. And you could say, well, it's a motto, it's a value, it's a saying, but service is our recipe. And it was on a fast food place. I'd rather have good ingredients as our recipe.
Okay. All right. So let's look at the lean perspective. So I have inferred this perspective from the HBR article. Next slide, please. So I take responsibility and I beg Mankind's forgiveness if I got these things wrong. So so these are what we're going to do with each of the perspectives is give you a sense of what are the main approach, the main philosophy. And so the philosophy behind lean is really these 5 principles, and the goal of those principles is to improve quality. It's usually used in manufacturing, so improve the quality of the product, to eliminate waste, to reduce production time, and reduce overall cost. So you'll notice that these 5 steps, I'm not going to read them out or principles, but they are very much like steps in a continuous improvement process. And you'll notice the first one, define value. So as decision professionals, that is going to strike home because that's one of the things we talk about in DADQ all the time, and also actually in enterprise risk management. So as we go through, Bill and I will kind of highlight a few little compare and contrast things like that. But these are the main principles of lean. So lean thinking. Next slide, please. So when we take those generic lean principles and apply them to strategy execution, here is the approach Mankin is recommending in the HBR article. So the first thing is to define a performance ambition, and that performance ambition is both a desire, what you want to achieve, something an aspirational goal, but it's also the financial objectives attached to that. So to make it more concrete. The second step is to compare that performance ambition to a multi-year outlook that captures the likely strategic and financial trajectory of the business if current strategies remained unchanged. So it's a way of thinking about that future world. What are things going to be like in the future if we don't change anything? And then when you compare that to the performance ambition, you get what is in step 3, the gap, which is what they call the strategic backlog. So that's really a document that lists the highest priority strategic, operational, organizational, and financial challenges to achieving that performance ambition, given what you've got now and what you expect to happen going forward. The fourth step is to prioritize the items in the strategic backlog, and he suggests 2 criteria. The first is the value at stake. So what is the economic impact, the gain of, or the reduction in the gap if you resolve the challenge? And the second thing is the urgency on the critical path. So if you reduce that challenge, thinking about which challenges need to be done first, second, third, and also making sure that they get completed in a sequence and on time, that you're able to address or capture crucial opportunities. And then the last piece is to put that into a decision calendar, like what you've prioritized to work on. And as you knock them off, as you get them done, then the lower priorities move up. So it's an evergreen, your decision calendar is an evergreen process. Next slide, please. So I pulled this out because I love this quote from the article. So business is a game of choices, and good choices start with strong alternatives. But most companies fail to consistently explore multiple options when making strategic decisions. So I'm sure this rings true for everyone from the DADQ world. And as a risk person, we see this as well. So next slide. Let's look at how he brings that in. So he talks about a 2-step process or 2-phase process for enhancing ongoing strategy implementation. And the first phase is facts and alternatives. So that's really leadership engaging in an expansive dialogue to look at the critical facts to really understand the causes of underperformance. So that the causes or what can cause that 30% gap, right? That many organizations are seeing, or deficiencies in the firm's strategic position. The second thing, so he didn't put it in these words, but he put it in similar words. So to resist the impulse to treat symptoms rather than causes, and in other words, to not to jump to solutions too early, to really understand the causes of underperformance. And then lastly, to use standard criteria. So another way to make it a more standard process for assessing alternatives. And so he gives the example of using future cash flows so that various alternatives are assessed on the same yardstick. And then the outcome of that process is really the team has enough clarity to go away and develop a set of viable alternatives. And he does speak to all the challenges of coming up with viable alternatives and the poor practices we often see in organizations. The second phase is around choices and commitments. And so this is where leadership chooses that path forward. So, thinking back to that little, the factory example I gave you, which path, which are we going to use, an incremental or transformational? What is the path we want to go on? So, to do that, leadership reviews the evaluations of the alternatives that were done, uses an agreed upon criteria to select the best one, and so those criteria are really the values that are going to drive trade-offs, and then defining performance milestones for the chosen alternative and identifying the resources required. And at the end of the day, the outcome here is a decision that commits resources to the selected alternative in exchange for the expected performance improvements. So there's a correlation between those two things. Next slide, please. So he gives this example from Amgen of how they did the strategic performance monitoring piece of the process. So what they did is they integrated performance dialogues into their monthly operating team meetings. And, that's often the way what I recommend to my risk management clients is to look at their risks and their risk management activities as part of a regular management performance check-in. So with these performance dialogues, what they did is they had the team look at how well they were executing on those commitments made against the strategic backlog. So they developed something they called Sensing, which was a metric monitoring platform that tracked both performance using both leading and lagging indicators. And then prior to the meeting, to coming to that dialogue, operating team members had to review the key metrics for whatever they are responsible for, a therapeutic, a geography, a function. And if they were underperforming, that accountable executive had to present at the performance dialogue the variance, and identifying the causes of the suspected causes of the variance and propose a solution to close the gap. Interestingly, they also at those meetings made time to talk about overperforming areas and understanding why they were so successful, why they were able to hit it out of the park, and really looking to identify practices that maybe could be leveraged and boost success elsewhere. So nice little example from the HBR paper. Next slide, please. So a few key questions. So one, do leaders across the organization use a standard approach for strategy implementation decisions? If not, you might want to consider using some of these approaches. Have you developed a multi-year outlook? So really thought about the future trajectory with your strategy or with the current strategy, and then, comparing that to get your strategic backlog. And does the organization consistently explore multiple options when making strategic decisions? That he spent a lot of time in the article talking about that. And then finally, do you have consistent criteria for assessing options and for making trade-offs? I often find when I'm working with clients that this, especially for making trade-offs, folks complain that the trade-offs are not transparent, and that makes the buy-in for execution difficult. Next slide, please. I think it's over to you, Bill.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. I find the page up. I find this modern advice to explore multiple options a little bit amusing, since that's really the core of what we've been doing for decades. So we're suffering because we're not really getting the message out. And we know that because we have management committees and that say, just tell us what the answer is, just tell us what we should do, just calculate the strategy. And I used to have a slide in every single one of my presentations that said, just big point, large point fonts, you cannot calculate a strategy. So it's so frustrating sometimes that the world still is lagging behind. And even when you help them and the companies say, oh, that was a great project, we need to have you come back and help with this project. Well, you go back to help with that project and it's the same mistakes all over again. So it's not looking at the options that you have. So since today we're talking about falling short of strategic objectives, there's a couple different ways we can look at that from a decision perspective. First of all, our starting point is framing. If it's not framed properly, you're not going to achieve it, except by accident. And if you achieve it by accident, you probably could have done it faster and cheaper and better to achieve more. Anything you do in life that you achieve by accident is probably not the optimum. So we have framing alternatives, information, trade-offs, reasoning, commitment to action. Don't forget you actually have to do that last one. But a lot of the time I find our process gets in the way unless we are constantly thinking about the solution. We can get pedantic within our own process, and it can appear to people to be a little bit of navel gazing, even though it helps them do things faster and cheaper and better. They still think, oh, that takes time. I could have come up with this solution on my own. They couldn't, but that's what they believe. So we always have to be aware that process can get in the way. When it gets in the way in strategy implementation, it's a different thing. It can make strategies, the outcomes be less efficient, and it can make the outcomes be slower, but it eliminates the rework time. When you get partway down the path and see, oh, the world has changed. Well, we should have done X. Is it too late to change? Maybe, maybe not. So this is my strategy model. And today we're looking at implementation of the strategic decisions, the strategic plan. That is really concentrated in that gray band, and we'll touch on the outside, the outermost layers of this onion. But competitive advantage, that's offense and defense, and controlling your own destiny. You guys should be tired of me hearing about how important that is. But if you do not control your own destiny, somebody else will. So in the framing part, if you don't talk about the scarce resources, the things that you're going to be competing with other entities to get limited helicopter time, limited farm workers, limited source for pharmaceutical ingredients. If you don't cover those off, there's no way that you're going to be fully successful. So understanding where the control points are in your quest for that ultimate strategy is vitally important. And then notice I have the big gap there, change management. Communication of what the objectives are is only, I'd say, about 15% of the effort that you need to put in. Because, take the town hall. I hate town halls. Everybody gets together, they go down to a big room, they sit, take an hour or two off work to hear an upper level manager talk to them about this new strategic vision. And okay, everybody ready to go? Go! And they go back to their offices and or desks or plant or wherever they happen to be headed to do their work. And if you ask them what they learned, say, oh, we have this strategy to do this now. Great. How are you going to change what you're going to do in your job? Well, I don't know. They haven't told me that. So change management is critical. We're dealing with humans. If you leave a town hall not knowing what you personally have to do to help achieve the new strategic plan, it's not a very useful town hall. So let's look at the pathway. Always concentrate on the pathway, because let's assume we've framed it correctly. It's a reasonable strategy. It's a reasonable destination. The thing that can prevent us from getting there is the pathway. And the pathway is devised by access. How will you create a material sustaining entrance into that strategy? The vehicle, how will you attain the needed presence? What sort of presence is that? And what is the execution speed and move sequence? How are you going to position yourselves to enter the market? How are you going to position yourselves to achieve control of those control points? Then this is on the foundation of what I like to call preservation. Your strategy that you develop should not be ephemeral. It should be robust. It should be sticky, is the word that I like to use. If a strategy is sticky, that means it is resilient to change, and you are resilient to change it, if that makes sense. But recognize as you're going along, as you're implementing the strategy, there are three things that you have to do to account for the environment, that externally focused area changing. And that is contingency planning, I'm thinking, ooh, that's so close to saying scenario planning. It's not scenario planning. Do not create a strategy using scenario planning. Use scenario planning to test the resiliency of a strategy, but do not create a strategy using scenario planning. It does not work. It leaves you out on a limb of a tree that is a low probability of being there. So contingency planning. Assure that you're looking after those threats that you might see. Use the tool, the pre-mortem tool, to look back and see, given it does go wrong, what happened to make it go wrong. It's important that you catch that tense change. A pre-mortem is looking in the past at something that did happen. And the emphasis there is it takes you away from the mindset of what could happen. No, this is what did happen to make this a horrible strategy. You wish you didn't have your name associated with it. And then a BATNA, that's the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, is what that stands for. Think of it as Plan B. Where do you find your pinch points? Where do you find those control points, those scarce resources? What happens if you don't get control? What happens if you don't have a defensive strategy? What happens if your competitor is going to jump in and react to you? What's the best alternative that you have? Got to feed these monsters, because they will sneak out from under the bed and bite you big time. So when we look from a decision perspective, how we can support an implementation, that's really in that center part, the execution. But we have to have good framing that doesn't create an overstretch goal. Okay, that strategy, that ultimate destination has to be achievable. When you're figuring out the strategy of getting to grandma's house, you don't think about getting 50 miles past grandma's house, because you know that you always come up about 80% short. Now that's not what you do. make sure that the strategic destination is solid. It's not aspirational. You looked at control, you've looked at the competition, what they may do, what they might do, what they could do, and create defensive barriers so that they don't do that. And a big problem is there's no plan to get there. People haven't talked about the pathway there. They've just said, this is where we want to be, go for it. That doesn't work. So in the execution, I like to look at the critical path management. In project management, the critical path is the slowest chain of items that you need to complete in order to achieve full project completion. But while it's easy to point those out, we have uncertainty. So we want to do what's called a surprise assessment. And that is an assessment of how frequently other items will jump onto the critical path to disrupt your timing. It's good not to be on the critical path. If you're managing a task that is on the critical path, the best thing that you can do is to make it good enough so that it leaves the critical path and somebody else is stuck with trying to get theirs off. If everybody works to stay off the critical path, that helps you achieve the end result faster and hopefully more efficient. The destination should not be aspirational. It shouldn't be constructive bias related. So that's when a manager goes, excuse me, if we do this and that and that, and the competitor does this, and we can achieve that, that's our strategy. That's what we should do. Those probabilities are essentially nothing. Remember change management. So the key things that I want you to remember, the key questions I want you to ask for the decision approach is your strategy really a strategy? Is your destination external and reasonable? Now, that doesn't mean it's external to the company. If you're managing a project within the company, your external can be outside of your team, outside of your project, but within the confines of your company. Have you framed the pathway to your destination? And if you were the competition, how would you disrupt what you are trying to do? Back to you. You're on.
Next slide, please. So this slide shows my version of the risk management process. It's completely compatible with the many risk management standards that are out there. They all have basically the same steps. Mine has this little added, the whole purpose of our steps in the process is really to communicate and align and get on the same page about what's important, what the risks are, what we're going to do about them. So you'll see that it also looks like a continuous improvement process, but it has a bit of a risk twist on it. And it starts for enterprise risk management, maybe a little different than other forms of risk management. It starts with knowing what the strategic context is. So when it comes to strategy formulation, it's understanding what's going on in your external environment, etc. When it comes to strategy execution, it's much more about, given your strategic plan, what are the risks? How can you drive success? That's what we're trying to look at here. All right, next slide, please. So I do like to think about this growth cycle. So quite too often in risk management, we focus just on things that can go wrong. We talk about the upside of risk and creating value, and then we go straight to the negative, all the things that can hurt you. And so I like this model because it helps us think about where how strategy happens in an organization. So it starts with strategic visioning, understanding your vision for success for the future. And that is different than what you're doing today. The second phase is transitioning. So how do we get from where we are today to that strategic vision? And that'll be big projects. It could be major acquisitions, but things that we're doing to evolve our business process, transform our business process. And then the third phase is the ongoing business. So now we've done the transition, and we are conducting our business in the new way under the new strategy. So I think it's the next slide that I put in. Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to mention here is that typically we actually see in most organizations, their ERM efforts are focused almost entirely on phase 3. And very little on the strategic visioning and the transitioning. But there's, in many ways, the greatest opportunity for ERM to contribute is in phases 1 and 2. So we see more actually in phase 1, or more activity really in phase 1 than phase 2. But we're going to focus on phase 2 now. So next slide, please. So, and another thing I wanted to introduce was, and this comes from the Oxford scenario planning approach. I know Bill just said don't use scenario planning, but it actually, so this is really to help think about what's going on in the internal environment from or the business environment from a risk perspective. So, and it defines 3 types of risks. So contextual risks, what's going on in your external environment. And those are things that typically organizations don't have control over, but you do need to know what's going on so that you can react to those things, right? The second kind of risks are transactional risks. So these are risks that occur at the boundary of the organization, and the organization has some control, and it usually through contracts or relationships. And then the third is operational risk. So that's really where the organization has a lot of control. So it's just, bringing that risk mindset of how risks arise in your business environment, and the ways that you can influence and or control, the degree of control you have. But you always have to respond to them, whether they're contextual, transactional, or operational. You need to be ready for them. So next slide, please. So when it comes to strategy implementation, we'll call them hazards. We'll use the term from risk management. But here are 4 very common ones, and ones that can really be detrimental to achieving the full performance promise of your strategy. So the first I'd call hidden assumptions, and that's that it's really, these become unidentified risks. So there are assumptions that we have not recognized that we're even making assumptions, right? We are taking some things as fact when they are really beliefs. So we're not testing those beliefs, right? So that's one of the major ones. Another one is not having signposts, or not knowing what signposts to look for when you should be considering making a change to your strategy, because now your business environment has changed. Maybe new risks have arisen. That's caused new risks to come up in your business environment. A lack of visibility around what could cause the strategy to fail. So I think Bill used the words control points. So it could be control points. It could be levers that you can control, that if you're not controlling them well, the strategy will fail. And then an absence of a shared understanding of interrelated drivers of success and drivers of risk. So in the risk field, and in many other fields, we tend to think of risks as separate items, and we assess them separately, and we come up with mitigation separately. But in reality, they tend to appear multiple risks at the same time. They can cascade in different ways. There are interdependencies. They don't appear as clean, independent, unique things that are happening. So not understanding how risks interconnect is a huge risk or hazard for strategy implementation. Next slide, please. So the approach from an ERM perspective is really to bulletproof the strategy, because we're really thinking about how do we deal with the risks. And for most people, when we think about risk, we think about the negative things that can stop you from achieving your strategic objectives. So there's really 3 stages to this. The first is really identifying your strategy execution model. And so this is really understanding what it will take to have success, what are the factors that will drive success, and mapping them out visually so we can see how they interact and understand how uncertainty and risks can arise within that implementation environment and with that implementation model. So quite often when I go into organizations, there is no common understanding of what the execution plan is. There are a whole lot of assumptions about how the strategic plan is going to be executed, but not something that is on paper that we can all agree to and that we can see what the drivers of success and of risk are. The second stage is to quantify the hazards in the plan. So really taking that visual model and quantifying it. So very often in risk management, we tend to use qualitative assessments, the famous risk matrices. But this is really about, using a Monte Carlo model to quantify your risks. So, and by doing that, we can understand the full range of outcomes and prioritize what are the most critical hazards. So what are the most important drivers of success and of failure. So we know where to focus our efforts on the implementation. And then the last part is about putting in place actions and risk mitigations to safeguard the success of the strategy. And so that's things like identifying the signposts and looking for them, looking to detect them so that you've got an early warning indicator that something could go off the rails so you can address it. The other thing is having contingency plans and playbooks at the ready, and also making sure you have the capacity to actually implement those plans. In many organizations, what I often see in government organizations, there's wonderful contingency plans on paper, but no actual capabilities within the organization to implement those contingency plans. And I'll go to the next slide, please. So after the 3-step, so I wanted to focus a little bit on safeguarding value and that it can take different forms. So one is once we have the quantified hazards, right? It helps us to see the unstated assumptions, those things that could actually change once we make that visual model. And then that allows us to monitor for change going forward. So, we saw monitoring in both the other 2 perspectives as well, and put in place contingency plans. So that was definitely there in Bill's DADQ perspective. And by understanding the key drivers of success and the uncertainty around those, we can prioritize actions to influence those and maybe define off-ramps as well for where we might want to stop doing a certain alternative. And then really understanding the connections between the variables that drive success and could cause failure. So, and that really allows us to put in place the plans to maximize the resilience of the strategy. So I think Bill also used that word resilience. So something that comes up in the another one here that comes up in more than one of the perspectives. Next slide. I think this brings us to the end of our oh, I forgot the key questions. So key risk questions. So one I like is, what has to go right for the strategy to succeed? I find that question is really powerful to do the first step, which is coming up with a visual execution model. If we understand what has to go right, we can, I like to use the influence diagram approach, and that really helps us put together that execution plan. The other question to ask ourselves, especially for risk people, is, are we taking enough upside risk? So is there enough risk in that plan? Is it ambitious enough to achieve our strategic goals and objectives? Because trying to not take risks can be the riskiest thing you do. And the third question there is, so when you're doing a check-in monitoring, is one of the most important questions is, what's changed in our business environment? And how does that shift our assumptions and our understanding of the uncertainties in the business environment? Fourth question, do we need to adapt our strategy execution model so that we can achieve and sustain our desired growth trajectory? So that, to check in with the plan. That's the other thing I often see with strategic plans, is people stick to them even when it doesn't make sense to stick with them any longer, or parts of it anyway. And then the last question is, are our risk management playbooks and capabilities adequate? So this whole idea, if our contingency plans and our playbooks are just a paper exercise and we don't really have what it takes to execute, they're not really worth the paper they're written on. So those are the key risk management questions. Next slide, please. So just want to come back to those key takeaways. So we've tried to prove the case that most organizations experience a significant gap between their strategic objectives and their actual performance. That different disciplines have developed approaches to close this gap. We looked at 3 of them today. I'm sure there's other ones we could look at as well. I have colleagues who work in the field of project management, and they are trying to solve similar gaps. And then finally, if you want to enhance strategy execution decisions, the questions that you ask matter. So these sets of questions we've provided, we'd like to get your input. So that's actually the next stage of our presentation. And I'm going to turn things over to Daniel. So we have listed some questions. Bill, if you could advance the slides one more time.
Okay, we do have a question that's been sitting there for a while.
Oh, well, we can talk about that, but I'll let these ones sit here. So we thought of 3 questions that might get your creative juices going, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on any one of them. So which question has been sitting there?
Okay, Louisa asked at 4:33, so sorry, it didn't see it. For value at stake, should that also include factors other than economic? Absolutely. The context, just like from my perspective, competitive advantage, social acceptance, social permission, those are all going to be possibly non-numeric as well as non-economic. And right now I'm assisting in the closure maintenance of a mine where we have a portfolio of projects that are value creative, cost reductive, and risk benefit. So risk reduction. And so we have a 3-fold overall objective, and the options can favor one or the other, or different combinations of the 3 to various extents. And it's a very interesting problem in order to optimize so that you reduce cost while you maximize the risk benefit, the risk efficiency, and the capital efficiency of doing it. So yes, absolutely. The value at stake is more than just economic factors.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I agree with you. There's lots of things that could be added to that list.
Yeah, so we'll take other questions for the next kind of 20 minutes, have some dialogue. I'm gonna just jump in there with a question because I think change management, and you touched on this earlier, is this key enabling area, but it's often underserved. There's a transition, often the strategy development and all this excitement, and often done by management consultants. And then they transition over to the execution side, which is more done internally, perhaps with some management consultant support. But then organizational change management and actually touching on the human resource, how people individually get benefits within the organization is a form and a key driver of a gap where there's this new strategy, but then no one knows actually how it changes their job and they don't have the right tools to learn what it is. So I wonder if you could talk about someone that does this well and how have you seen it done well, as opposed to sort of it's a gap, because I keep hearing about the gap. So who does this well?
So I'll jump in on this one. What I have found has helped me in my career in dealing with this, and I deal with culture change all the time, is to shift away from thinking about overcoming resistance to building readiness. So it's really making sure you make very clear and you quantify what's your current state, what you want to get to, and what you have to do to build readiness for people to move through the various stages of actually making that culture change part of how they do things, right? So and we don't invest enough in that, allow enough, right? So we spend a lot of our time. So I showed that strategy model that had the 3 phases, coming up with your vision, transitioning, and ongoing business. So that culture change happens between the transition part and the ongoing business, right? So it starts with the transition, but you don't actually get the value of that transformation until you've done the culture change and it becomes part of the ongoing business. So that's actually where it sits in the process. And if you think about how to build readiness rather than buy-in, you will have more success.
And change management professionals have a different reputation. And that's because change management professionals typically aren't classically technically oriented. Yet the hierarchy within a company, within the technical teams, within the execution teams and the project management people, they are technically oriented. So they often look at change management as this fuzzy-wuzzy nonsense that people really don't have to. Anybody can do that. I gave a talk at the Society of Petroleum Engineers several years ago, and I said, okay, this is about change management. This is about the technical aspects of change management. And they said, oh, we all do that. Okay, no, they don't all do that. And it is very frustrating sometimes to see companies get rid of talented change management professionals because they look at it as just this fuzziness, this oh, it's touchy-feely. We don't do touchy-feely. Let's go build a plant.
Thanks, Bill. I really, that resonates with me in my experience. I wish change professionals were valued differently. Aditya, go over to you.
Can you hear me?
Gracias, Roberto.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is on change management itself. So when you mentioned that we want to change something, let's say if there are cultural changes. So I feel it really difficult that how company transition through that cultural changes. So for example, I have some examples in my career that sometimes companies were, let's say, going forward with the normal pace and not much aggressive. But now if they want to move towards the aggressive side, product development side, and in that sense. So now let's see, if a company is working with that pace, let's say for 15, 20 years, and now if you suddenly say, okay, we would like to go aggressively. So I think I realize that sometimes there is a, back force from employees over there that, I mean, because how you can, convince people, or how you can communicate that strategy, or what change management system you can place over there so that you can achieve those transition gradually, I would say, not obviously immediately, but gradually.
Uh, and so was there a question in there, or is that more
Yeah,
of a
yeah, yeah, yeah,
statement?
yeah. I mean, this was my question. I mean, so
Yeah.
how we can communicate the such ideas that, okay, we would like to, I mean, just for this example, that okay, we would like to now move towards this direction and very aggressively, because there would be competitiveness, whoever comes first and acquire market, let's say, and they will get the place over there. But again, probably because of the overall culture of a company, let's say it was okay, people are in a mindset of doing things in a very easy way, but then now suddenly you find out that okay, now we have to change our strategy. And again, it doesn't happen frequently, but in the past I have seen that sometimes company go and change that strategy in that domain, and over there I really feel that such cultural changes are very difficult. That is what I feel. I mean, you can go with the all technical changes, or you can deviate to strategy and product, all those things are still probably achievable. But when we have to deal with the people, where you have to change the culture, the way you work, the way you take the things at your work, and
Right.
how you are processing those things. Yeah. So
Uh, so you're asking a big question anyway. Um, well, I'll refer you first of all, if you go to my Riskwise website, I've got lots of articles there, and I have 3 on overcoming resistance that are really all about culture change, and they all give strategies for um, culture change when there's different kinds of resistance, right? Because and or lack of readiness, right? So where so for the vast majority of people, it's really about explaining why the change is needed, and why the current way of doing things isn't working anymore. Right. So that for most people, if you give them a rational reason, that actually works pretty well. The other main kind of um, I'll say resistance or lack of readiness is emotional, right? So it comes from the fact that people are attached to the current way of doing things for one reason or another, and either they fear the new thing that's coming in, or they're used to the current way of doing things, and you know they prefer to do it that way, whatever it is. And for those people, it's much more about addressing what the emotional thing is that's causing them to hold very tightly to the old way of doing things, as opposed to opening up and embracing the new way of doing things. And the third kind of resistance or lack of readiness comes more from a political kind of perspective, and that's really because the change um, doesn't suit you politically. Either it means a loss of power or a loss of control or something like that. And I like to quote, I forget the fellow's name. He used to run AIMCO, the Alberta pension fund, and he said for those people, they need to be made to understand, uh, you know, uh, uh, why they they think it's inconvenient for them to do it, but they have to with those folks, it's much more of a, making them understand why they've got to do it. It's more than an inconvenience for, so it's one of the toughest ones. And it's usually actually, the emotional one and the political one they're like maybe about 20% each of why people don't want to come on board with a change in culture, a change in strategy. So the big one is really the rational one. So and you need a good, strong, rational case to also deal with the other two kinds, the emotional and the political kinds of resistance. I hope that helps.
I think it helped. It's unlocking some for me. Nigel, do you have a question? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I've really appreciated this, and I especially appreciated the repeat references to assumptions. I found ever since I've entered the DQ arena, assumption raising has been one of my secret strategy strengthening tools that I employ on a sort of a clandestine basis, which has been great. So I appreciate that. My question, though, is really when it comes to strategy strategy creation and sort of rollout. What kind of struggles or observations or maybe wins you've observed in terms of how many people at how many layers of the organization are involved in strategy? Because I've seen both ends of the spectrum where it's kind of behind closed doors and it just shows up without much conversation. And I've seen the other side of the equation where it's overly burdensome and too many people involved. And I'm wondering if you've got any suggestions about where the right balance is.
It does depend on the company and the situation. I know the most the happiest implementation or strategy development session that I ever led was with a company in Europe, and they were changing their North Sea development strategy. And what we did was we gathered their C-level people and the main managers for the different functional areas of the company into a conference room for a day, and we just discussed things that we could do and what we'd need to do in order to achieve that. And so in the background, we were creating a large objectives hierarchy chart so that we could then present that to them the next day. We included, and I encourage you to always include HR in the strategy discussion, because again, like I said, this has to be done by people. And so there has to be somebody that can speak to the people equation in the strategy development. It can be an advantage, it can be a disadvantage, it can be a control point, just depending on the situation. So it's vital to have a strategically literate person in there. Now at this company, unfortunately, the person repeatedly just said, just tell me what you want me to do. Okay? And that's not the way I tried to coach them, say, no, you're part of the strategy development. And they maintained, just tell me what to do and what do you need done, and I'll get it done somehow. So, well, that doesn't fit into the ability for us to capture it. And that person, 3 weeks later, they were gone. They were replaced by a more strategic thinker. And it's sad to see somebody leave, but it's vital to have implementers, it's vital to have leaders, and it's vital to have, this might sound strange, a couple of junior people to participate. Because if you can get junior people in there, and I'm thinking organizational development, current and future. So you have a couple of young up-and-comers who are not in management, who can see how it works. They're viewed by their peers as, oh, they got chosen to do that. We can have a say in that. And it starts to pull skin into the game for the strategic change. And that's, I always, when I go to a company, I said, give me a junior person that you want to follow around to train to see what's going on, because they will be important. So I'm all for creating a larger group. Now, when I say larger group, that still is about 10 in size. Anything more than that, and it gets difficult to manage, and you start to have more and more personal bias coming in, because it becomes, you can see the political walls come up, and they're protective of their jobs. So it takes some facilitation in the beginning to say, this can work well if we're looking at where we want to be as a total company in X years, and then say, what are the options? What are our options of how we could be at that point? And then you pull it out, and you never end up picking one of the options that they choose. It's always going to be a hybrid, but to have that extra input is vital. You can't have a group of, I had at one time, the board of directors was going to establish the new strategy. And push back hard on that, because they're not the implementers, they're not the leaders, they're not respected in the company. So think from the beginning, organizational development. And even if you mess up a little bit on who's attending, you're going to be fine in the end, because it will be implementable.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. That definitely helps to answer my question. And just a comment to the previous question about change management in terms of getting engagement. One way I found is a good way to hook people's interest is to, we talked earlier about making a decision calendar, or just, to-do lists. I like to have a separate to-don't list to raise the topics or tasks or operations we're not going to do anymore, and that's always a great way to get people's attention one way or another. So just wanted to make that comment as well. So thank you.
I like that one, Nigel, the don't list, because I think there's a lot of forward thinking. Bill, Linda, you guys have worked in sustainability strategy. Do you want to maybe ask a few questions to Diana and Bill around, or what discussion topics resonate with you? Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know you have good ideas. So,
well, I can talk a little bit about sustainability, since I was the oil and gas industry representative to a sensitive environment sustainability conference. If you want to ever go any place where you're treated as the enemy, that was the place. But it was fun. Got to see Galapagos turtles and everything, and try to tell people that no, not everybody is evil in the companies.
Yeah, I'll just say that I really appreciated the different perspectives. So I want to thank all of you guys, and I was absorbing a lot, and I was also trying to think about it from the way that I was drawn into. I've been drawn into both strategy and decision making from my background as initially as an environmental engineer, and then ultimately, and many times you guys spoke of it from the management consultant perspective. I was the environmental practice leader at PricewaterhouseCoopers. So, I gained a bit of the business perspective into all of it, but at my heart, I also was still a bit of a environmentalist. So, what was in it? I'll ask you a couple of questions. One, when you were talking about the future casting process, how long are your normal strategies when you're trying to combine decision science, decision quality with strategy decisions? What's the time periods that you're generally constrained to when you're working with a strategy team?
As in for development or for implementation?
I think it's both.
Well, the development for my favorite one, the one that I really like, it took 3.5 months. It was about a month of qualitative, and then the rest of the time was qualitative assessment, comparison, looking at the downside risks, mitigations, and then we even got into acquisition strategies. How do you want to be placed? How do you want to grow? How do you? So we do the whole strategy model that I showed. So people, finance, social, and product, competitive advantage, control, access, preservation, vehicle, and staging. Those are all components, and together they allow people to, well, they allowed senior management to go to the board and say, this is what we want to do. And it was a nice full package, and they got approved to do it. And then they got taken over 6 months later. But.
No, I think you missed my question wasn't how long of a time period to do the strategy. When you're doing your future vision, how long into the future is the future vision that you're now trying to forward cast to or scenario to? Because this is one of the problems that we have been dealing with. I'm just curious.
It's variable. I've done it for a company where their horizon was next year. I've also done it for a company that their horizon was 6 years. Rarely does it go beyond 5.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I have noticed you used to see more 5-year time horizons on a strategic plan, and that has become shorter and shorter in recent years. And I think it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the level of uncertainty that we have in the world. But I think the further you go out in the future, it's always been murkier, right? But and so that's that question I had about what's changed in our environment and how do we need to adapt our plan. That's the so if you can have a annual check-in, but I still think it's worthwhile to have a longer term strategy. So most
really
strategic plans are 3 to 5. Yeah.
It speaks to the resilience of the strategy. If you do a good enough job in the beginning, your strategy may not have to change with a good deal of uncertainty or change. Now, I know that's a really fuzzy answer, but it goes to how resilient is your strategy?
Yeah.
How sticky is it going to be?
Right. And sometimes when people are using those strategy formulation templates that the strategic planning consultants use, if they don't do a good job of it, what they have in their strategy is a lot of assumptions. Their assumptions about the future are really today's current state.
Yeah.
Right. So that plan is going to be out of date in less than a year, because the way they're thinking about the future is basically that it's going to be exactly like today. So you really do need to try to think out further and really think about, like, look at the trends and, think about as they spin out, where could we be as these trends develop in future?
I once sat in a meeting presented by one of the big external companies that was trying to get the job that I was actually doing at the time. But the client wanted me to sit in and listen to them. And what they said was that, and yes, everything can change, and it can change as early as next month. That's, it's quite the useless statement.
Yeah.
Well, it might have been Price Waterhouse.
David, over
I've
to
done
you.
I've done my share of criticizing Price Waterhouse, so no worries there.
Thanks,
I think it
Bill.
was.
We'll go to David now, and then we'll go to Linda, and then I think we'll maybe take a few more questions. But we're past our typical hour and a half for this session, so we'll probably wrap up. But I will make this this record. I'll snip this and make at least the presentation area available with the slide deck, because it takes me. I find it helpful to review it a few times and think about this, because it's hard to pull it all together.
And I have to run to a ferry, so I appreciate cutting it.
David, over to you.
Well, just, I mean, first to say this has been really, really interesting. I realize this and you kind of invited us out of our CIM work to come and have a window into this, and it's really got me thinking the intersection of decision science and strategy implementation, and kind of that the idea of actually, that the tool that sits there for strategy implementation. Just to throw in a couple of thoughts. One is on the sustainability side. I mean, sustainability, I think in some businesses is a strategy, and in other businesses, it's really a layer that fits in. Sustainability is, have you in your strategic decision making accounted for sustainability issues, and in your strategic goals, are you, are you, do you have objectives that recognize what role it's going to play? And then just the third, I mean, I was thinking on the time horizons, and I think there may be some benefit to thinking of strategy as having a slightly different life than the strategic plan. And I'm thinking in mining, we're making decisions that have 10 to 20 year time horizons, really. So fundamentally, your strategy of what is going to make the company successful has to be pretty persistent, but the plan about how you are executing to that strategy may well vary quite a bit over in sort of 3-year increments or 5-year increments. But I think it's sometimes helpful to think of those a little bit separately. You may kind of refresh your strategy, but what you're more likely doing is saying, all right, what we're executing right now, does that still represent what our strategy is based on?
Yeah, I like to tell people to remember that they cannot create a probabilistic mind. They have to create something, and then it has to be flexible enough to account for change, but not too flexible to cost a lot of extra cash to do something that people will look at and say, well, that's useless. So it's the adaptability of a strategy is important, but typically those changes are, as I was talking about, transformational versus incremental, and those change events create an incremental change to your strategy. You're not going to build a lead zinc mine and then decide, oh, let's make this a copper mine. You can't do that. So you are pinned in by logic and reality. The best you can do is try to not shut the doors to certain change, but don't carry the change out. It's the whole basis of option value.
I would also add that sustainability is another kind of loaded word that means different things to different people. So, when I first came across that word, it was around environmental sustainability, and there were lots of conferences on that. And now we don't see so much of that. But in the context of strategic planning, when we talk about sustainability, we're talking generally about the long-term success of the organization. So, can we sustain that growth trajectory, the value the organization delivers? So, so we see organizations, like Shell diversifying not just fossil fuels, but looking at other forms of energy production, you know, so they are looking at that long-term sustainability of the organization, and they are pursuing strategies that will help them do that, even though they too are in a business where the investments are very long-term, right? Like they're buying assets that they're going to operate for decades, right? So it very long-term time horizons, but there's, you know, strategic plans are tend to be shorter horizons. So, and that's so Bill kind of poo-pooed the board being involved in the strategic plan, and I kind of would agree.
I said
you wouldn't want them
board,
to be driving it, but
that's right.
But
they
what I
can
want to
drive
say
the
is-
need for it, but they
So,
shouldn't drive the solution.
So, but the boards, and actually this is a place where boards often fall down. Actually, their most important job is to look at that long-term sustainability of the organization and, you know, make sure management is on top of that, right? But so many boards do what I will call counting paper clips, right? They are looking into little details and almost acting like an auditor. And that's actually the long-term value and sustainability of the organization is where boards should be looking. So that's my soapbox.
I hear you. You know, it's a complicated, but none of these things are easy. This is why where we sit and why these discussions are so rich. So final question over to you, Linda.
Yeah, I don't have a question here, but I want to re-emphasize 3 points that were made that I think are critically important to sustainability. First is to ask the question, what can go right? Need to that for so many reasons, that's an important question to ask. The second is that for sustainability, particularly, but really for anything, context matters. So the external really matters, the environmental external, the political and the social external can derail anything you're doing if you're not paying attention to it. And the third is what Bill said about including non-management younger generation. And it's not only because they have the attention, but it's because they see things that we don't see. It's an entirely different perspective, and that's really important for the success of strategies.
Yeah, and not just necessarily a young person, but actually someone who's new to the organization, because the longer you're in the organization, the more you become steeped in the existing culture and the sacred cows, and you don't see those things anymore. But new people see it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks everyone, and great to see the new members. I'll continue to have Nate distribute the invite across our greater audience. This is great to see some new people and great to have different venues. And thanks so much, Bill and Diana, for your insightful presentation. I'll save it and